Hello, and welcome to our show, Great Britain in Focus. I'm James McCullough.
And I'm Pascal Mary Rakovich. In this episode, we walk with Bishop Keenan around Paisley in Glasgow as he discusses Scottish Catholicism with Kevin Turley.
We hear Roy Peachey speaking about Catholic education in Britain and the rights and responsibilities of Catholic parents to be the primary educators of their children.
And Fiorella Nash uncovers for us the genre of Catholic crime fiction and investigates the influences that Christianity has had on famous crime fiction authors.
We join our on-location team as they journeyed to Scotland to explore Scottish Christianity. They start by meeting Bishop John Keenan, who takes us on a brief tour of his diocese of Paisley.
Bishop Keenan outlines the history of the Catholic Church in Scotland, and he explains to Kevin Turley the ideas that Pope John Paul II had on nationhood and how they can be applied to the Scottish context.
Hello, Bishop John.
Yeah, good to see you, Kevin.
Good to see you. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Good.
And yourself?
Really glad to be here in Paisley. What's this?
Well, this is Paisley Abbey, which is a 13th century foundation, Benedictine foundation. The monks from Cluny established this abbey here, close to the site where St Mirren, who was an ancient 7th century Celtic missionary, began his mission, where his horse stopped at the River Cart, and he
is that the River
Cart? That's the river here,
right.
And he established his mission here, and 7 centuries later he was still regarded as a holy man, and the town of Paisley began to build up around his mission, and so that persuaded the Cluny monks that when they were establishing a foundation here, that they'd establish it near his mission. I suppose they were, impressed with the continuity of the Christian faith through history, and probably the continuity of grace. So this abbey then has continued in its Christian worship every single Sunday for 700 years until today. Obviously in the Reformation it became a Presbyterian foundation. It's now the Church of Scotland parish in the town centre of Paisley, and still to this day there's Sunday worship. So again, that shows just the continuity of Christianity through time. That is to say that Christian worship has been here every Sunday for not far off 1,000 years.
That's incredible.
You just have to go back another 1,000, you've got Christ himself. It brings the incarnation very close, I think.
And tell me a little bit about when Christianity first came to Scotland. Roughly what years are we talking?
Well, Christianity came to Scotland pretty much with St Ninian. He had gone over to Rome, and he studied in Rome and came back essentially, we would say, as a bishop, and formed this mission in Galloway, pretty much near Whithorn.
Which is south of here, right?
Which is southwest of here. Moving towards the southwest, so we're moving toward the border with England on the west. He established a mission which was called the Candida Casa, which is the first White House. And from that mission he was able to extend up to through Strathclyde and various areas. But it seemed that it's not really clear that there was a continuity of Christianity at that point. It seems that he established something, and it's not just quite clear how much of it survived. And so we need to wait until then the 6th and 7th century with the Irish monks like Columba in Iona, like Kentigern in Glasgow, like Mirren here. Columba was probably the most dominant. In Iona he established his monastery, and wave after wave of the monks extended out to Britain, then St Cuthbert going over to Lindisfarne, and many of them then also subsequently going to re-Christianise Europe, but Columba was also an astute political figure.
Yes.
And so just at the time of the development of the Scottish nation, where things are coming together, but there was still conflict between 2 or 3 major clans and peoples, the Gaels, the Scots of Dalrata. But he was able to negotiate peaceful resolutions and sometimes to back the right man. And so because of his political astuteness and involvement, once the king or the clan leader becomes the top dog, then Christianity follows the faith of the king. So really, from Columba onwards, we've got this pretty much established. As Scotland becomes one nation, then Christianity becomes the established religion of that nation. They say that William Wallace, Braveheart, was educated in this abbey. He certainly lived not too far away in Elderslie. Later on, the daughter of Robert the Bruce, who managed to establish Scotland as a nation, and from then on, Scotland always had this protected sense of nationhood, because just shortly after Robert the Bruce's victory in Bannockburn, the Scottish nobles sent off a letter to the Pope at the time, and that letter really argued for the right of freedom and self-determination of peoples. And they asked the Holy Father to accept their argument. The Holy Father did accept and endorse their argument, and thereafter Scotland, through the difficult early years, had its nationhood pretty much protected. And the letter, which was called the Declaration of Arbroath,
yes,
really formed pretty much the battle address that Wallace gives as captured in Braveheart just before that crucial battle. And if you read the Declaration of Arbroath, it's not far from what the Bruce had said. And many historians will trace that letter, the beginnings of the idea of the right to self-determination and kind of nationhood as something part of the dignity of human beings.
So it sounds, Bishop, almost like the Scottish nation politically was built upon a sort of religious foundation, a Catholic foundation?
It was really, it was certainly protected by the Catholic Church. I mean, I would probably argue that idea of freedom, that idea that an individual can have a dignity which is inalienable and inviolable, I think that really comes, don't they say, it comes from the idea of the incarnation, that God, the person of God, can take form in a human being, so that every person then attached to Christ by baptism has an absolute value and an absolute dignity. And it seems to be the case that played through the development of philosophy and classical philosophy and human rights.
It kind of links with some of the ideas of the theology of the body and developed by John Paul II, isn't it? Would you say there's a certain sort of, I mean, not that truth ever goes out of fashion, but there's a different way in which it's presented?
Well, I like John Paul's idea of nationhood, which is quite a personalistic idea.
Yes.
Essentially, he traces nationhood back to clans and tribes, or essentially families. And in any family, that members of that family have family traits. And then as families get larger into tribes, that some of those traits remain as something which distinguishes that people, and that you develop a nation then because certain key figures, political or religious, maybe kings or saints or queens or whatever, really particularly embody those values, and thereafter they become the focal points of the values of a nation.
Well, Bishop John, thank you so much for this amazing tour of Paisley.
It's a pleasure.
A place I've
Yeah,
heard
it's a
of
pleasure.
often, but I didn't realise so much history was concentrated, not just history of Scotland, but history of Christianity in this part of the world. And what's really pleasing is as you say, it's the continuity. This exists, you exist, St. Marian's work continues.
Christ yesterday, today and forever.
Amen. Thank you very much, Bishop John.
Bless you. God bless you, Kevin. God bless you.
Author and teacher Roy Peachy speaks to James about his book, Did Jesus Go to School? They explore themes relating to parenting, home education, and the rights and responsibility of Catholic parents to be the primary educators of their children.
We discuss the issues with secular education and speak about the importance of placing children in environments which foster the flourishing of human nature. So welcome to our studio, Roy.
Thank you very much, James. Really good to be here.
Well, first I'd just like to find out a little bit about your background and what you've done. Tell us about your work.
Okay, so I'm a school teacher now. My sort of rather fancy title is Director of Curriculum Development at a school in Croydon. But I suppose I've had a fairly unusual academic background. So I started off with a history degree, and then I went and worked for a little bit in a school and picked up an English degree with the Open University while I was doing that.
Right.
And also a qualification of which I'm most proud, which is a postgraduate diploma in Lake District Studies.
Right.
Not many people can say they've got that.
Not very vocational.
Not hugely vocational, but great fun. I was learning
Yeah.
in Lancaster University and up a mountain.
That's fantastic.
Up various mountains, in fact.
Okay, I'd love to talk about that more, but it's not really the point of our talk today. So, and also Chinese studies. I
Yeah, so
believe.
then later on I
Yeah.
studied for an MA in Chinese studies at SOAS, which was also fascinating in a completely different way.
And you're an author of a few books as well, I believe. So tell us a little bit briefly about those.
Yeah, okay. So the first one was a book called Out of the Classroom and Into the World, which was all about Catholic education. So the subtitle, the rather grand subtitle, is How to Transform Catholic Education.
Right.
And so that one was really trying to look at the state of education at the moment
Yep.
and to suggest various ways in which we might be able to do something about it.
Right.
Then this year I've had 3 books published, which is quite fun. So one of them was a novel about the Chinese in World War I, Between Darkness and Light, that's called.
I see. And that came about from your Chinese studies?
It did,
Your
yes.
degree?
I came across, I discovered a book in the library while I was studying Chinese studies about the Chinese in World War I. And although I had a history degree from Oxford, I had no idea that the Chinese had been involved in World War I.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I need to do some investigation here. And it's just a hugely interesting story, a really unknown story.
Yes.
So eventually that grew into a novel
Yes.
about a labourer for the Chinese Labour Corps in France.
Yes. And then you have a book with the fantastic title of Did Jesus Go to School?
Yes.
So this is our book here.
Did Jesus go to school? And other questions about parents, children and education. So the idea was to ask a series of questions, which then led off into a series of other questions.
Right.
Did Jesus go to school being the first of those?
Yes.
And it's, in a sense, it's Lectio Divina in book form. So each chapter begins with a Bible passage, and then I meditate on that Bible passage, starting with a particular question. So are parents gardeners or carpenters, for example? Were Adam and Eve children? Did Jesus go to school? And then see where it took me. So it's a book that tried to look in a different way at the whole field of Catholic education.
Right. And maybe we'll start with that very broad question. What is the point of a Catholic education?
Well, I think Pope Benedict XVI summed it up beautifully when he came to the UK and he spoke to school children. And he talked very pithily, as he always did, but really beautifully about the purpose of education. And he talked about the very laudable, practical ends of any education. But he also talked about our ultimate end.
Right.
And the fact that God wants us to be happy, and the best way we can become happy is by becoming saints.
Yes.
So in a phrase, I suppose the purpose of Catholic education is to help us become saints and help students, help children, help our children become saints.
Right.
And yet, of course, as we all know, when we're in school, that's probably not top of the agenda always.
I could imagine.
Uh,
Yep.
And so it's finding a way in which we can get beyond the sort of nitty-gritty day-to-day. You know, we've got to cover this syllabus material, we've got to work towards this particular exam, while keeping that really important end in view.
Yes. So this really brings us now into where can the parents be involved in this? If we can't just leave the schools to do everything for us in terms of a Catholic education, so what part do the parents play? And you mentioned about, in your book, about being the parent being the first educator. Where does this phrase come from?
Well, it's just a part of Catholic social teaching.
Right.
And yet it was completely unknown to me. I had no idea about this particular hugely beautiful part of Catholic thought. I'm a convert, and so I hadn't grown up with the faith, sadly. But even then, when I did convert and did become a Catholic, and even though I was teaching in Catholic schools, I'd still not heard this idea.
Right. Yeah.
So the parent as the first educator is really the grounding for everything. There's this wonderful phrase that I read in a beautiful little book about the Catechism of the Good Shepherd, where the author said that if everything that you do with your child is education, everything that you do with your child is education. And looking at it like that, every parent is the first and primary educator of their children.
Right.
We educate them by who we are, by how we are. We educate them through what we say, through what we do. So being the first educator of your child doesn't mean you educate them up until the age of 5 and then you wave them off at the school gates and schools take over.
Right.
You continue to be the primary educator of your children throughout their lives. So it's a huge privilege, but a huge responsibility as well.
Yes.
And so the place for schools is as a backup for the parents. Schools are there to assist parents in their God-given task as the primary educators of their children.
Right.
So it kind of flips the usual perspective on its head, I think. And we live in this society where we have a sort of suspicion of experts, and yet strangely we trust these educational experts. We kind of hand over our children to teachers and to schools and say, okay, you do the work for us a lot of the time. And yet it shouldn't be like that. Schools can only work on the basis of what the parents are doing and have done.
Yeah. Roy, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
We hope to invite you back soon for some more discussions.
That'd be great.
Kevin Turley and Fiorella Nash meet in Regent's Park in London, close to the home of Sherlock Holmes, to discuss the genre of Catholic crime fiction. They explore important influences that Christianity has on famous crime fiction authors, especially with regards to seeking truth and justice, as Chesterton's Father Brown so clearly brings to light.
Fiorella discusses her latest novel, See No Evil, set in post-World War II England, and the protagonist in her story, Father Gabriel, who is portrayed as an English Benedictine.
And welcome to Regent's Park, central London, just north of Baker Street, the home of the most famous detective in all the world, Sherlock Holmes. And I have with me today Fiorella de Maria, best-selling Catholic novelist and also crime novelist. Fiorella, welcome to GB in Focus.
Afternoon, it's good to be on the show.
So, Farella, what's a nice Catholic girl like you writing about murders?
Well, I think you've made a judgment there about about crime fiction. I think it's a wonderful thing for a Catholic girl to be doing, because it's all about the truth.
In what sense?
It's about seeking the truth, and it's about seeking justice. You know, we're all interested in the truth. We're interested in puzzles.
And I suppose we Christians, we Catholics, have a head start when it comes to mysteries.
Absolutely. And, well, you know my theory about Sherlock Holmes. He's basically a Jesuit, you know, in terms of his thinking.
Explain that to us.
Well, you know, he has a very methodical way of looking at things, you know, the clues, the magnifying glass, all that. Well, I think he really is supposed to be a Jesuit because Conan Doyle was Jesuit educated up at Stonyhurst, and I think a lot of his methodology is just that very, very rational, you know, way of looking at the world, you know, looking at the world around you. So I think, in fact, it's a very Catholic discipline.
Of course, Conan Doyle was Catholic.
He was. I mean, unfortunately, he drifted away with the fairies towards the end of his life. He got involved in spiritualism like a lot of Victorians unfortunately did. But you can see the influence. You can really see the influence. And of course, Agatha Christie, famously as well. Poirot, he's a good Catholic. Well, maybe not so good, but he's certainly from a Catholic background. So I think we've got a big history here. We've got a good heritage.
Yes, I mean, Agatha Christie was a high church Anglican, as was Dorothy L. Sayers, and they are really some of the queens of the golden age of crime detective fiction. They're also involved with whodunits, and I think I'm right in saying that your crime novels are of that genre.
Yes, I think most crime fiction are whodunits really, but also whydunits, howdunits. You know, it's not just who did it, but I think as well, of course, we have the Father Brown influence. And not all the Father Browns were whodunits. Sometimes it was to do with, you know, why somebody committed a crime, or, you know, how somebody got into a locked room or whatever. So there's a bit more of a mystery aspect to it. So I've been quite influenced by Chesterton as well.
So tell us a little bit about your detective, because I think you're into your third novel.
Third one just coming out, yes.
So what's the title?
See No Evil.
And just backtrack. So there's 3 novels. So give us the titles of all 3, and then the name of your detective.
Well, the first one is called The Sleeping Witness because one of the victims is in a coma right the way through the story. The second one is called The Vanishing Woman because a woman literally disappears under the noses of the witnesses. And the third one, See No Evil, is about the murder of a man who witnessed a massacre. All the stories are based just after the war. A lot of secrets, a lot of people reinventing themselves. So See No Evil deals with that aspect of wartime atrocities, but they all look at some aspect of the war history.
And your hero?
He's called Father Gabriel. He's a Benedictine, an English Benedictine, and he's a late vocation. He's got a history, so we hear a little bit more about his past in each of the books, particularly the last one. And he's supposed to be a little bit autistic. He's a little bit on the spectrum, so he sees things in a very obsessive way. He, you know, gets an idea and he goes with it. He's hopeless socially. He's always getting himself into awkward social situations. So there's a bit of comedy to it as well. There's a certain amount of humour.
I mean, if he's a Benedictine, isn't he supposed to be in his monastery saying his prayers rather than out solving crimes?
Well, you see, the first mystery happens in the monastery or in the grounds of the abbey, and then unfortunately he makes such a nuisance of himself that he's sent into a parish to help someone. An elderly priest had a heart attack, needs some help. So I send him out of the monastery because I don't want it to be like those other murder mysteries, you know, where there's about 20 murders in the same area. Like, nobody would want to live in that village. Like Midsummer Murders, I mean, there'd be nobody left, or, you know, Inspector Morse, where you really shouldn't live in Oxford. You know, as a Cambridge girl, I think Oxford is a bad idea as a university choice. But I want to move him about a bit to avoid that slightly awkward scene, but sort of situation. But of course, you then have the problem that when the detective moves a lot and there are always murders in his vicinity, that looks a bit odd as well.
Yes, it starts to sound like he's your chief suspect. Shouldn't we be investigating Father Gabriel?
Well, I mean, this is it. I mean, all of these big detectives, wherever they go on holiday, someone gets killed. They go on a tour, you know, the Nile, someone gets killed. So there's no way of getting around the fact that it's a completely implausible genre. You just have to lose yourself, you know, in the weirdness of it.
Has being a crime novelist given you a certain view of the world? I mean, you've written other fiction as well. You've written historic fiction and various other dramas and stories. You've also done radio dramas and film scripts. Is crime writing the most enjoyable, do you think?
I find it enjoyable in that I like planning the puzzle. I like working out how it's going to happen. Of course, you always work it out backwards. So you start with the crime, and then, that's why one of the difficulties with any kind of mystery writing is you never really know if it's obvious or not, because it's obvious to you. And I have a horror of writing too predictable stories, so I was quite refreshed to find out that my radio mysteries are really difficult, because they look quite easy to me. I think they're enjoyable in that you get the chance to get to know the characters a bit more closely than you would otherwise, because it's a series. I feel, I'm getting to know Father Gabriel at a slightly different level to my other characters. I don't find it as creatively enjoyable in that it's quite formulaic as a genre. There are certain things you have to include. There are certain rules you can't break. For example, you can't have too much information too close to the end because people feel cheated. And writers, by definition, are usually not rule keepers. Don't tend to like being constrained too much. Whereas with literary fiction, you can just let your imagination run wild a bit more. So there are pros and cons.
And I suppose the other rule is the butler can no longer be the one that does it.
No, we've had to create other characters. But then you see, the great thing about historical crime fiction is you can have all these old characters. You can have sort of housemaids hearing strange noises through the wall and whatever. I think there's a bit of escapism to it as well, to be honest. I think, we're living in very difficult times politically, and so perhaps people just like to lose themselves in a surprisingly unthreatening world, even though it's a crime. It's a crime story. They like the manners and the dinner parties or whatever. And
there is something very reassuring about an Agatha Christie novel. I mean, it's not going to challenge you on any level, really. Yeah.
No. And yet, on another level, it ought to be awful. I mean, why would you read about someone getting their head bashed in for escapism? And yet, it isn't that. It's the whole atmosphere, isn't it? Everyone wants to sort of look back to this imagined, perhaps more definite age, more certain age.
Well, thank you very much for taking time out from detecting and solving mysteries and murders throughout the city. And how can people find out about Father Gabriel? Where do they go to find out about the books?
Well, I've got an author page on the Ignatius Press website, and I can also be found on Amazon and all the usual book-selling pages.
And often found on Baker Street, probably solving mysteries too.
I'd be hopeless at the scene of a crime. I'm very squeamish.
Rella, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Full versions of these interviews can be found on our website. EWTN Great Britain is a self-funded charity, so we appreciate your financial support to help us bring you great British programming.
Please visit our British website, ewtn.co.uk, for further details on how to donate. Do join us next time. Goodbye and God bless.